And a warm welcome to everyone. This is the last in our series of climate workshops, and this is run by Wild Horizons. We're a regenerative group looking to set up a land project in Wales. And today's workshop is around the topic of land and food justice. I am very warmly kind of surprised and also happy to see many people, different people that we haven't seen before. And that is a pleasure to welcome you all into our space. So the third in a series of our workshops, and here we are. So if we can move to the welcome slide, please, Ryan. And here it is, a kind of more formal welcome. So my name is Liba, and as I've welcomed and prompted all of you to introduce yourself and put your names, your pronouns, and also how you are feeling today. It's been very rainy here in London. It's still raining, chock-a-block, but fortunately now I'm inside and dry. So yeah, please keep introducing yourself if you haven't. Otherwise, if you have, thank you very much. So make sure that you are on mute if you're not speaking today, and cameras can be either on, off, or on. There will be some participation, especially towards the end, with some Q&A and some reflections, some ability to contribute. There will be some questions asked by some of the presenters. We have 3 presenters today. That's myself, Liba, and my colleagues, Jessica, who will be doing some bits around colonial conservation, and also Rose, who'll be joining in the second half for some case studies around indigenous ways of looking at land and food justice. Secondly, I want to note that the session will be recorded. It is being recorded now, so the consent is to share on the YouTube. If you have an issue, please have a direct message with Ryan to notify him. Please put your pronouns and your Zoom name if you'd like, your name and your pronouns. That would help. And tech support today is Ryan. He's one of the Wild Horizons co-directors. Please private message with any issues. And finally, questions and comments can go into the chat. And the next slide. Right, so this is the kind of table of contents that we'll be covering today. Apologies if we run slightly over. It was a very packed workshop that we have today. We've done quite a lot of research on this because I felt personally that it's very easy to misrepresent indigenous and global South struggles when it comes to land and food justice. And having a sense of deeper knowledge and research could only increase our veracity, could only increase the kind of integrity of what we're presenting here. And therefore, some of the content is a bit meaty, so please just take that in, let that kind of sit with you. But we may go slightly over 8:30, which is the projected time to finish. So before I go through the table of the contents, I wanted to just go through the narrative of why we're holding these climate workshops. So with the climate and ecological crisis intersecting as part of wider systemic challenges, such as racism, as well as the pandemic, it's imperative that we seek alternative futures to step into. Our connection to the nature through resilient practices such as permaculture and creative writing can help us achieve a sense of justice with the food as well as the land. Learning from indigenous and global South cultures, we'll address some of the planetary crisis by understanding how growing with nature can help to heal us and the world we inhabit. Living as a regenerative community requires deep roots in understanding nature as well as the many aspects of it which unfold within our daily realities. And we seek to draw inspiration to help guide us to a future that is in keeping with the planetary boundaries. All of it is in direct relation to what we are doing as Wild Horizons and as a kind of regenerative land project, looking to tackle some of these crises around food justice, land justice, and we'll kind of go into some of those definitions in the next slide. But just before that, I just want to go through these contents. So as I mentioned, the definitions will be next. We'll be looking at BPOC growers, so BPOC meaning Black and people of color as a term to refer to people who are non-white in the UK, and the kind of growing kind of scene within the UK. Next, we need to actually change this, but it's going to be decolonial conservation, looking at conservation and the many aspects that kind of takes. The kind of colonial conservation, as well as a kind of decolonial kind of way of thinking about that, and that's what Jessica will be presenting. Then we'll go into the spiritual connection to the land, which I'll be talking about how it's not just about the physical material aspects of growing, it's also very nourishing in a spiritual level. We'll have a short 10-minute break in between that, and then the indigenous case study talking about Mexico, which Rose will present for about 15 minutes, talking about the Three Sisters, which is a permaculture technique and some growing aspects, and how we can learn from the indigenous people when it comes to growing with food. Then we will go into why we need to grow our own food. Why is it imperative to have food sovereignty and think about growing in these times of crises? And then one of the things at the end is about what we can do with all of this knowledge that we've kind of gained across these workshop series, and especially today, what is the actions that we can take up to start practicing some of these aspects that we want to challenge. And finally, there'll be a Q&A section, which is going to be interactive for all of you to input and talk and say whatever you feel about the workshops, about this one in particular, and any reflections before we kind of sign off for today. So that is the structure. Let's move forwards. All right, so we have some definitions here. Food justice and land justice. I want to, before I go into what each of them can be defined as, I want to bring people into the chat box and invite people to say what that might mean for them in terms of an example that they can say they feel strongly about, or they can connect to, or even just a definition that feels right for them. So please, I invite all of our attendees, participants, to put in the chat what you think food justice is, land justice is. And if you can provide an example from your own personal life, that'd be even more brilliant. So let's see what comes through in the chat. I will keep an eye, and I'll be able to say something. And Jessica's already off the mark, being able to afford a healthy diet. I think that it's definitely part of both. So if I can talk about food justice here as a top of definition, all communities must be empowered to grow, sell, and eat healthy food, which is fresh, nutritious, affordable, culturally appropriate, and grown locally with the care of the well-being of the land, workers, and animals. So it's a sense of almost self-care in terms of the ecology of the land, in terms of the animals, in terms of the planet, but also ourselves and our local communities. I think all of those are incredibly important to realize. It's not just the land and the people, it's also the animals, the biodiversity of plants, all of these things, having a sense of connection that run through it, a sense of justice. So I'm seeing a few more things coming through, which I'll be reading. Ems mentions how it's about no commercial ownership or patents of seeds. That is definitely a part of it. Having some sort of seed sovereignty. For example, the Real Seeds Company in Wales, pioneering company when it comes to something like this. Thank you, Ems. Megan mentions how having access to culturally important food and the food that nourishes in many different ways. Absolutely, we need to have culturally sensitive ways and diverse range of foods to cultivate. We don't need just food that has been traditionally grown in the West and in Europe here. We also need to embrace foods from indigenous cultures, from cultures in Africa, in Asia, and many other continents, because they're all part of kind of understanding this sense of justice. So thanks, Megan. And Ryan says access to resources for everyone. Absolutely. Holly says access to ancestral seeds. Yes, that is true. And spaces for seeds and agroecological practices, skills and knowledges, knowledge exchanges. Absolutely. Agroecology, again, very tightly kind of connected and tightly knit with this sense of land justice, which we'll define now. So land justice isn't just concerned with unequal patterns of land ownership, but also with unequal access to green spaces and food sources. So that sense of kind of the privilege and people who are already kind of part of our domination-based culture having the most access to land, which we'll see within the statistics at the bottom of this slide. So returning to the land is itself a way forward, a path towards reconnecting with food production, ancestral farming practices, collective ownership, and community. So again, that was actually borrowed partially from Land in Our Names. Land in Our Names, which I'll talk about in the next slide, are a BPOC-based land justice group looking to further people of color kind of presence within the kind of regenerative farming when it comes to having access to land and growing, which is really the kind of primal aspects of what we're talking about today. So before we move on to that next slide, just that quote at the end, I just want everyone to kind of take that in, because as much as it is maybe not surprising, it is still staggering. Currently, the top 50 landowners in the UK own over 12% of its landmass. They are also overwhelmingly white and affluent. So knowing that actually this kind of sense of land is very aristocratic, is very hereditary, it's been passed on lineages, and there is a real sense of a lack of social mobility when it comes to accessing land. For example, the environmental sector as a whole is one of the least diverse sectors after farming. So those are the two least diverse sectors when it comes to representation in terms of color of skin. And I think that's a real kind of representative of the kind of institutional racism, the systemic kind of challenges of racism and oppression that exist within these fields. And I think as a project as Wild Horizons, we're very much committed to having radical inclusivity as one of our core values that we really like to practice, that it's not just another group of white middle-class people coming together, that it's a lot more than that, that we tackle some of these issues of inequity and injustice. Next slide. So here is something I alluded to. BPOC grows in the UK. Black and people of color. There is obviously some issues with some of these terminologies. Some people prefer people of global majority. Some people prefer black and brown growers. But for example, the report there, Roots into Food Growing report, as well as groups like Black Roots and Land in Our Names, they use the word BPOC. So we'll stick with that for now. So I am also part of Black Roots. Black Roots is the first multi-generational Black gardening group in the UK. It's set up in Wolves Lane in North London. And they do quite pioneering work in terms of getting people of color to grow, to allow space to cultivate plants, and to essentially, in a way, through food growing, you kind of own the means of production. You have a sense of connecting with the land that nourishes you, as we will talk about later, spiritually as well as materially. And I think that's a really important point. Land in Our Names, again, they're doing very pioneering work. Some people like Josina and Mama D have been doing this for a very long time in the UK, and they're gaining more and more traction. So they kind of started from Land Workers Alliance, Land Workers Alliance being a kind of a grassroots peasant and land workers kind of group, affiliate group, which is advocating for rights in the UK for people who are farming, small and medium scale farmers. So please check those groups out. Just on the right hand side, I just want to point to that Roots into Food Growing report. It's a very recent report, only out 2 weeks ago. And Jessica has shared that report link 2 months ago, actually, rather. And I think it's a very interesting report because it's a landmark report. There's not really been many studies when it comes to looking at people of color and accessing land in the UK and growing. And there's some really good recommendations, which I recommend for people to read and see how they can advocate within their own spaces and try and promote some of this stuff. And the second link there, the directory of the BPOC groups, that's something, one of the groups I'm involved in and I helped to form, called the Anti-Oppression Circle, where a kind of intersectional group looking at race, class, and many other forms of oppression and how they are ultimately connected, the root causes of them being capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, and many other forms which are systemic, taking up hundreds of years of oppression. And I think we wanted to compile this because often it's hard to find this kind of information and to know where to look. And that is a very useful directory for people to have. Now, coming back to the points in the slide, the second point about the rich indigenous history of cultivating fields and growing food from the ancestral heritage. By looking into the kind of diversity, as was kind of pointed out earlier, the diversity of food, and to kind of nourish ourselves through different seeds, open pollinated seeds, things which haven't been tampered with in unnatural ways, things which are, let's say, more organic or more closer to what nature intended in terms of the growing. A lot of the food that we have is chemically tampered, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware here that it's chemically through pesticide, through many other forms of weed killers and sprayers and these things that Rachel Carson documented in the 60s, the Silent Spring. I think this kind of thing is so pervasive in the farming and agricultural sector that it's really deteriorated the soil and eroded our sense of justice when it comes to growing ourselves. So learning from indigenous people that actually we need to pray to the soil, we need to do devotional songs and sing hymns. That's as important actually just planting in a very mechanical way. Taking the kind of soul out of it doesn't necessitate really much growth and actually leads to depletion. And I think that's an important point that we'll kind of go on to later on. The last point there is about white supremacy and the systems of oppression have typically marginalized people of color from accessing land and growing their own food. As is often the case in every sector, whether that be education, healthcare, or even farming. The systems of white supremacy and white privilege have marginalized people of color because of that history of racism and exploitation and colonialism, which has many hundreds of years of history. And therefore, unfortunately, a very small percentage of Black and brown people own land in the UK. And again, a very small percentage own their own homes in the UK. If you look at home owners in the UK, overwhelmingly, it tends to be white, middle class, or affluent people who have access to it. Just lastly, on the slide, I want to point to that, the bottom right there. So there's some statistics I got from a webinar by Leah Penniman. Leah Penniman is a kind of pioneer in America, is a Black grower, set up an organization called Soul City Farm, which is, again, pioneer in terms of BPOC growers in the US and does amazing work when it comes to this. So you're just looking at how the regenerative farming practice, the fossil fuel, it's such a small percentage. It's not even 9% of compared to industrial agriculture. You see how really it literally saves the planet if we start transitioning to a more holistic and healing way of practicing farming. The carbon sequestered is staggering, 4,000 plus pounds per year. That is a lot of carbon taken out from the atmosphere. And it has huge implications when it comes to tackling some of the offsetting measures that we need to take in place and put in place. And then the topsoil depth, 300%. When you think about soil being degraded because of these because of these seeds being planted in by companies like Monsanto, which people like Vandana Shiva really talks about very well. I think it's an important point to notice that increase in topsoil can only be good for growing and for the plants to cultivate, and for carbon to be sequestered, and to be just more regenerative for the planet. So that is that slide. Next slide. We're going to be showing you a video. So growing is for everyone. Growing is not just for people who have time and privilege. Growing is for people who can also be activists, who have little to no access to food themselves in terms of buying food. People who've been very marginalized in our societies. And I want to show you through this video that it's possible for all of us to grow. It's not just a handful of us who can. Please play.
All of these workers are owners of the business. This business is the West Oakland Farms. My name is Elaine Brown. I'm a former leading member of the Black Panther Party, and I'm the CEO of a nonprofit called Oakland and the World Enterprises. I haven't given up on the principles that I adhered to back in the days when I was in the Black Panther Party. One thing we did right here in West Oakland is we started a program of gardens in the ghetto, believe it or not. And secondly, of course, as everyone knows, we had a lot of food programs because we recognized one of the greatest needs of the poor is food.
People who have formerly incarcerated looking for work, a lot of times we don't get hired because of our background. If you don't be afforded a chance to get out and prove yourself and show that you have a work ethic, you kind of like left to fend for yourself out on the streets, you know, go back to dealing or whatever, which I choose not to do.
This site in the next several years will be built up to create a model for the country to recognize that people who have gone to prison have got to have some pathway to earn a living, and they can't keep getting denied on account of their previous incarceration.
I have something to look forward to. When someone asks you, well, what are you doing? I was like, I'm co-owner of a garden out in West Oakland. And so I'm happy about that.
I've always seen myself in food.
Yes, so that is a very inspiring video about how essentially we can grow. It's about being accessible. It's about being affordable. It's about that being for everyone. People who've been incarcerated, people who've been very marginalized and oppressed in our society. Incredibly important that we allow the space for that to kind of flourish. So that is my section done for that bit. I'm now going to move on to this colonial conservation, which Jessica will be doing for the next quarter of an hour or so. Yes, Jessica, come in, please.
Hello, can you hear me? Amazing. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica. Just going to spotlight myself so you can see me. Amazing. So thank you so much for being here tonight. We really appreciate your attendance in this heat wave, really. I've really been struggling with it. So sitting through a workshop we don't take for granted. So really appreciate all of you being here. I'm going to talk to you about conservation as it's practiced today and what's wrong with it. We thought it would be really important to talk about that, especially in the context of land and food justice. So conservation, as per definition, includes actions that are intended to establish, improve, or maintain good relations with nature. So while that sounds great, the reality often looks quite different, unfortunately. So fortress conservation, as we call it, has emerged from the colonization of indigenous lands, and basically it means that so-called unauthorized people are kept out of the conservation zone, and often by military level force. And despite indigenous people having managed their ancestral lands for thousands and thousands of years, any human presence is seen as a threat to environment in fortress conservation. And this justifies the often very violent evictions of tribal people. Next slide, please. Just a little disclaimer that this bit will be very information heavy. So if you have any questions or comments or just want to share your feelings about this topic, because it can be quite heavy, feel free to share in the chat. So the impacts of fortress conservation on indigenous communities. There's, of course, social implications, namely people losing their houses, they can't grow or hunt their food or access rivers for drinking water or access the forest for wood. Many of them lose their jobs, lose their property, and they end up far away from hospitals and schools. And they're often very poor communities, which makes this displacement even more difficult for them. And the less visible cultural consequences include loss of their very culture and spirituality, which are very often embedded in the land. And without the land, indigenous communities lose their sacred sites, their burial grounds, and their shared community areas. And this loss of culture often has very dramatic consequences, not just for the communities, but also ecosystems, which are managed by indigenous people and have been managed by them for a very, very long time. Next slide, please. So where does colonial or fortress conservation come from? Colonial expansion was always kind of justified by Western cultures through racist and religious stories of European superiority, especially kind of the notions of managing the land. And Theodore Roosevelt, who is a former US president, he believed in eugenics, and under his kind of rules, segregation laws were very commonplace. If anyone here doesn't know what eugenics means, it's basically the practice of mating people with desirable traits to improve the human species. So really a horrible, horrible set of ideas, and still kind of pushed these days with the overpopulation argument, which has no scientific basis. So for 100 years now, we've been taught kind of the mantra of I think, therefore I am, under the term enlightenment, starting in the Enlightenment period. And it basically means that the human mind is seen as superior to the physical world. And this shift in thinking ultimately led to industrialization and the commodification and dominance over nature. And one example of these beliefs in action is the Yellowstone National Park, which was the first national park in the so-called United States. And under the premise of pristine nature that is untouched by humans, indigenous people were driven out of the lands they had cared for as long as we remember. And national parks are often owned by kings or colonialists, very powerful people, very, very rich, the rich 1%. And they're often used for hunting and tourism. So it's not really about conservation, but often under the guise of conservation, but really it's often a lot about profit. Next slide, please. So in reality, indigenous-led conservation is actually a lot more effective than Western or colonial conservation. We kind of use these terms interchangeably, Western, colonial, and fortress conservation. Different people use different terms. So as some of you may know, indigenous people make up only 5% of the population, but they protect 80% of global biodiversity. And the levels of deforestation are 6 times higher in lands that are not managed by indigenous communities. And overall land degradation is also, even comparing protected areas and indigenous managed areas, indigenous communities have a much, much lower level of land degradation and much higher level of biodiversity. So we do have to see this issue in a more nuanced way, because many indigenous and local communities are under a lot of pressure to modernize, so to speak, and they end up taking harmful practices from Western settlers historically and Western cultures. But indigenous conservation generally is a very necessary alternative, and it works much better than our Western model of conservation. Indigenous-led conservation must be rooted in traditional local knowledge of ecosystems in order to work, and it must also support livelihoods and be integrated in everyday life. So it's meant to be a way of life rather than a way of doing things. That's the core difference. Next slide, please. So what does community-led conservation look like in the UK, where we are based? In Wales, for example, where I live, we have the traditional concept of I filltir sgwâr. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It translates into square mile, and it basically describes the intimate connection to your childhood home. And across the UK, we have urban community gardens, like the ones Leo just shared with you. And they basically regenerate and protect urban ecosystems. And they also grow food, which is much more nutritious than, for example, supermarket food. And that's a growing movement, which is very beautiful to see. And also the rewilding movement really seeks to reconnect us with the land and return ecosystems to what they would traditionally look like. In conservation, there's a concept called shifting baseline syndrome, which basically means that what we imagine as regenerated nature is much closer to what we know from our parents or grandparents, but it's not actually what those ecosystems would have looked like 1,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago in their original state. So rewilding aims to revert those places or regenerate those places closer to what they would originally look like without harming people in the process. It is a controversial issue, especially with farmers who often feel like their livelihoods are being threatened by this movement. So it's really, really important to find a middle ground between caring for both people and planet, really. Next slide, please. Now, moving on, I want to say a few things about how land connection or disconnection affects, especially Indigenous mental health. We all know that being outdoors is really good for us and our mental health, but for Indigenous communities, this connection is on a much, much deeper level. Indigenous people's identities and culture, like I said before, are very closely linked to territory and their sense of place. And therefore, land degradation has a very, very negative effect on them. And when their ancestral lands change and their familiarity with the land reduces, that affects their well-being in many, many different ways, socially, psychologically, and culturally. Indigenous communities rely a lot on cultural cohesion, and in culture, land's being seen as part of their culture. And especially nowadays with climate change is severely disrupting Indigenous people's traditional practices because they're so dependent on natural cycles. And we see a growing movement of the younger generations in Indigenous communities who are not learning their traditional practices of using medicinal herbs, etc., because they're often hard to find. So basically, they're experiencing a lot of land degradation, displacement is still happening under conservation organizations. And all of this leads to Indigenous youth moving to urban areas increasingly. And that's a big problem because they're losing their connection with the land even more. And it's not only very problematic for the communities, but also ecosystems, not just locally, but worldwide. Next slide, please. I believe now I'm going to pass on to Liva.
Yes, thank you. Before I go on to the slide, I just want to introduce Rose, who's just sitting to the right of me. Hello, Rose.
Hello, Liva. Hello, Jessica, and everyone else. And everybody here. Nice to meet you all. Sorry.
So yeah, Rose will be presenting about the Indigenous aspects to the land after the break. But before that, there is a short bit. So let's play this video first of all.
This air that I'm sitting here and breathing as you and I talk not only comes from you and shares you in that manner, but it also comes from Oklahoma, South Dakota, Alaska, China, the Thunder Nation. And all of those things combined are now part of me, and the same with the water that I drink and the food that I eat. And the intricate connection that we have is very physical, very scientific, and very spiritual.
It's a part of me. That's where my ancestors are. They're right here. Anywhere I go, they have been there. That's why he was talking about every part of this land will thrill with the memories of my people.
We can not only say that my great-great-great-great-great-grandparents used to live over there. I can go over there, and all it is a drive or a walk. The settlers and European Americans and every other immigrant to this country, if they want to go see where their ancestors were born and lived and walked and breathed and ate and hunted, they have to leave here. I don't have to. That loss of connect is what is the biggest downfall, I believe, is that loss of reliance on the land and that harmony of creation.
People have wandered away from that idea of sacredness, that sacred connection, that spiritual connection with the land, with the people, with the air that we breathe.
I encourage people that aren't indigenous to this land, go back home and experience, even if it is just for a week vacation. Go back, see where you come from. Go back to where your people first put their feet and feel that soil, touch that tree, walk in that water, build that appreciation for the land that you come from.
This earth is a living being. We are simply blessed to be part of her.
That was a very insightful video. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I keep hearing from people who are indigenous elders is that the way we live in the West is very much kind of a kind of sick society, a society where we're completely disconnected from ourselves and from the world around us. If one of the kind of messages that was kind of spoken about in the previous video was how everything is interconnected. We need to understand the whole through ourselves, and we are nature ultimately. So kind of going from that, the kind of first point there around many cultures and traditions around the world having rituals around growing food and working on the land, such as devotional songs for sowing seeds. And actually, a little anecdote that from the Leah Penniman video talk that I watched in reference to that regenerative farming statistics I showed earlier. She was saying how she talked to an indigenous elder, and she kind of laughed at the fact that people here expect things to grow well without having some sort of devotional song or ritual to go with it. We just expect to plant a seed into soil and expect it to grow very well and grow into a full tree or plant or whatever it is. It shows our kind of level of disconnection, because this is what the practice has been for hundreds, if not thousands of years before us. But now, because of the prioritization of profit, of the kind of mechanical way and industrial way of doing things, agriculture, we've completely been separated from doing things like singing devotional songs for sowing seeds. So in Hinduism, which is kind of my own spiritual tradition, my heritage, where I come from, food is viewed as a gift from God. There are many agriculturists in South Asia, in India especially, is a very high percentage of people who are agriculturalists, and that's why the Indian farmer strike last year especially was so big. I think at one point there's 100 million people who attended it. You work on a land to provide for your family and community. So actually working on a land is actually literally your livelihood. Without it, you wouldn't be able to exist. You wouldn't be able to breathe and live. So the very rich biodiversity that acts as a form of medicine that can heal our bodies as well as nourish our souls. So the plants are as much a medicine as much as a food that nourish our souls, but also nourish our souls, make us feel whole inside. There's many rituals, beliefs, and cosmologies that can embed conservation and ecology within everyday practices. So for example, there's a couple of quotes here. Ex of the Guarani Embaya in Sao Paulo in Brazil says, "The land does not belong to us. It is us and all beings who belong to the land. We do not control it, but flourish with it." So it's that sense of separation that we formed in the West, like this is nature, we are going out into nature. It's not that. We need to reinvent that whole concept and understand that we are as much part of nature as anything else is. And the land that we're living on actually belongs to the land. It's not us being on the land. It's actually other way around. So the land does not belong to us. So the notion of the Ivirupa says all beings are deeply connected and interdependent, thus equal as brothers and sisters. There is no hierarchy. That's why we must treat all beings with dignity and care to live well ourselves. So again, that sense of interconnectedness with the land, there isn't a sense of separation. And that kind of goes into the sense of interbeing, which we explored in the last workshop that Neil kind of presented as part of our workshop on creative writing and nature connection. So I hope that kind of paints a picture of why it's so very important to understand that connection to land, not just as a material thing, but something nourishing spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, and otherwise. Next slide, I believe we've come to the break. So we're going to have a 10-minute break now. That means we should come back around 5 to 8 o'clock. So feel free to regenerate, stretch your legs, have some tea or water, have some food, go to the toilet, whatever it is that you need to do. And we'll see you in 10 minutes again for the second half. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, man, you see the police is gonna swoop that brother up off his feet, man?
Already, man, the cops have been hot on the block lately, man.
It's crazy, man.
Man, I'm about to roll up in here and get some chips, man.
Nah, brother, you ain't even gotta do all that, man. Let me show you why, though. Check this out right here.
Peace. You must cultivate the earth. Meditate, You must cultivate the earth. Plant the seed, meditate and take it in, You must cultivate the earth, plant seeds, meditate and take it in. I got a job with some teens, teaching hip-hop history and how to grow greens. Hard skills, big wheels, and it's the real deal. Green jobs, green thumbs up in the green field. And ain't nobody be ditching my class. I got the lifelong lessons, don't let your life pass. I got some knowledge on my mind. Cause in divine, I say divine, in the past time spit rhyme. So what's sustainable, kid? Don't assume, just break it down, see me in the teacher's lounge. What's sustainable, kid? Don't assume, just break it down, see me in the teacher's lounge. You learn how to write rhymes, how to grow food. What you learn, how to meditate, how to fight for tools. So what you learn, how to unite, how to rap crew. So what you learn, how to give back, how to pay dues. I watch my youth shine and elevate in 09. Cause when a cypher born, see you know I water sound. Breathe in, breathe out, and you let your power round. Leave your mark in the city and you skip town. Be impeccable on stage and hold it down. Do some Tai Chi, walk to this, follow me. A little bit of greens and some motivation. Gotta reach your seeds, gotta educate them. So what's sustainable, kid? Don't assume, just break it down, see me in the teacher's lounge. What's sustainable, kid? Don't assume, just break it down, see me in the teacher's lounge. What you learn, how to write rhymes, how to grow food. What you learn, how to meditate, how to fight for tools. What you learn, how to unite, how to rap crew. What you learn, how to give back, how to pay dues.
Green for all for the green. You better know it. Wanna let y'all know I'm happy that you was out here checking out the Wheatgrass video off the Teachers Lounge album. Get it on iTunes, Amazon, or greenforall.org. Holla at your man, DJ K with motivation. One love.
find direction, I'm a DJ in your town. Looking for direction, matter of fact, the produce section. Can I get more? On the way to school, walking by the prison door. Plus 2 liquor stores and a dog park. Talk about an eyesore when the post park. Have you ever seen a collard green when they grow up? No, show enough. But why they murder kings though? Because they scared of a brother who knows how to grow. Plus you got the hip hop dress, no process. Only eat that vegan food. I digest deeper than a subway. See me in the underground, living in the earth ship, living off my urban sound. Gotta keep it fresh and get some land and maintain. Cause everywhere I go, see things ain't the same. Everywhere I go, son, things ain't the same, man.
And it's cool, and it's cool. So cool, and it's cool to live, and it's cool, so cool, and it's cool, and it's cool, and it's cool, so cool, and it's cool to live.
Keep your head high and the struggle don't fall out. Keep your health tight, be ready to ball out. Speak truth to power, we got to move now. We gotta maintain, this ain't the same now. Tap used to let her drink, it ain't the same now. Natural gas up in the water, make your faucet flame out. You want some change now? You want some change now? Hotter than the sun's core, drilling for the oil, fracking at the earth's core. Good thing we all stood up to that keystone mess. Grow a garden for stress with echinacea. And rush the stage for Opalanga on that raw food diet. Have you checked the price of cancer? Maybe you should try it. I'm from the old school, that's what them elders say. Mentally free, but still eat like slavery. Digitally, I'm trying to see 2020 and beyond.
Programmed to be fertilized with God in my curls and earth in my eyes, the soil in my thighs and the branches of my flesh. Highlight maps to heaven, hard to read, I do my best. I'm heaving in my chest, my hands entwined with roots. Simple, sprouting fast, we can grow just what we choose. What you holding close to truth, can you make the people listen? To cataclysmic secrets in the chasm, speak a mission. But we were climbing like Jack on them beanstalks. And with these glass ceilings growing of the tree stops. It's Big Bang framing when the seed pops its shell. The tide ebbs and swells, we can't feel it from a cell. They opened up a jail, closed down the school. But keep your cool, son, not letting the heat wave make you sweat is rule one. Jewels won't turn to sustenance and food when the warming of the globe is done.
And it's cool, 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 so cool, and it's cool to live, and it's cool, so cool, and it's cool, and it's cool, and it's cool, so cool, and it's cool to live. And it's cool to live. And it's cool to live.
Okay, hi everyone, welcome back. If you can turn the screen on or come back in whatever way it is that you feel free to. So glad to see people here. So now we're going to move on to the indigenous case study, and we've got Mexico and the Aztecs, and this is the bit which Rose will be presenting. Take it away.
Thank you. Hi everybody. As I'm doing a project on just a case study on one particular indigenous group, and so I chose the Aztecs Mexicans as a group study. So basically, in the past it was Aztecs. They were mainly wiped out by the Portuguese and Spanish. Mexico then have a very low, from ancient times, I'm going from this, in the past, the Mexicans, they grew many varieties of sweet potatoes, corn, maize, and bean, and squash. Sorry, squash, I just panic a bit. Was their staple diet. And they grew it in it was a very low zero carbon footprint from growing crops such as the squash, corn, maize. And it comes through, they sort of made mud flats that were tied by reeds in the canals, which helped with the dredging the rivers, which causes much more river flow and an abundance more of fish. And they used to plant flowers, tropical flowers, encouraged a lot of birds, and the flow of marine life. Soil irrigation was not, well, it made the flow of marine life, but the soil irrigation was not, was zero, basically, because of this style of farming. And their techniques have been inherited for thousands of years. It's been passed down from king's bloodline as well, from generation to generation, and it's still used today through their ancient lineage, which was, they have spiritual ceremonies with food and drink, which they celebrate their ancestors. They put photos out, and it's they still do it the Day of the Dead every year, which is highly spiritual, and their gratitude to the planet for what the food they get from it, and also they gave back because they tried to take mineral from it without giving back. Spiritual, and the local communities provide offerings to their ancestors still to this day. It's exactly the same. It hasn't altered at all. And the reason they celebrate their ancestors is because they passed down this farming technique through the generations. They also use decaying plants to grow on this wooden mud flats that they had, and to put nutrient into it as well. So it was minimal waste, and it produced abundant growth as well, and invigorates the nutrients in the soil. The ecosystem maintenance is achieved through an interconnected system of processes. I can't even read it. Practices. So I've finished that, I think. And they paid a lot of attention to the spiritual aspects of their god and goddesses. So there's a goddess of the corn, there's a god and goddess of everything. Corn, sun was the main one, and corn, moon, and lots of others. So it's down to spiritual, but they don't just take from the earth to today. Drink also plays a lot of a very important role with it, like from the cactus and tequila. It's very important with the food. They value the earth and the animals, and it's linked with spirituality and ceremony. That's it, basically. We use the centuries. They do not drain the soil of the elements and minerals either. The crops were and are still used in celebration that Day of the Dead, the Day of the Dead every year. And that's strongly rooted in their culture and homage to their ancestors. Right, so I'm going to pass it on to the next one now.
Yeah, next slide.
Yeah, sorry. Oh, okay, thanks. Oh, not quite that slide. I haven't quite finished. Sorry, not that slide yet. I haven't quite finished. So basically, our Western system have, if we were to use their ways of agriculture or similar that's appropriate to our side of the world, i.e. growing local crops and not transporting products from the far side of the world, and taking a lot of the footprint, the footprint, our soil footprint, the carbon footprint. Taking our carbon footprint, we would not have to use so much aircraft and big shipping big ships that actually dredged the sea and ocean, destroy everything within it. And the planes, carbon footprint from the planes, if we were to all grow back locally, and plus it would save on plastic, and also involve local communities within what we were doing and being more community based, which we used to be. I mean, we could grow, even for our group, we could grow local veg, and what would grow here: carrots, potatoes. I know they came from the west, east. Carrots and onions and things that are here locally that will grow in our soil with our climate. Use it, what's in our climate, and herbs and other things. Yeah, sorry. Growing local veg and herbs and fruit as well, and sharing with others in our community, and inviting the local community in, so it's a vibrant community growth. And Mid Wales is a place where they want to regenerate as well, particularly, and they have the infrastructure, right, with the local steam train, which is opening. Also, I've just come from Teepee Valley, and they have said that they are, like it's UK, but they have a lot of what was now panic. I can't read it now. Forget it. But they have, yeah, I should think of it in a minute, but I panic in the video. Yeah, okay. But also, there's one thing I'd like to read, I think, from a little book I have, the paragraph. The present energy crisis in the industrialized nations is now the sign of worldwide crisis that is approaching. It's here. It's not approaching. It's here. And the crisis is rooted in the failure of modern enterprise, that is, that substitutes the machine for man. And this great project of transforming nature has changed into an impalatable process of subjecting the project and poisoning the consumer. But basically, our group as a community wants to regenerate, not just go back to nature, but regenerate for future generations. And I've just come from Teepee Valley, and they're doing a lot in that way, in that area anyway. And they did have some very good ideas, but I'm sorry, I've just been driving for 5 hours. And I can't remember. I will next time. So perhaps we get on to the video, which is very good. It explains far better than I do. So, food in the Aztecs.
Okay, here in Xochimilco, we have the waterlands, right? The wetlands. And behind me are reed plants. These are the plants that grew in the water. In fact, if I walk any further, I'm going to fall into a bunch of water. And in Xochimilco is the last area where you can see the chinampas in action. The chinampas were the floating islands of Mexico City. They're world famous because it's super fertile ground. And if you walk over here, you can see the gardens. What happens is the chinampas are very low to the water table because it's right next to the water, right? And it makes it a lot easier for the plants to pull up water and nutrients that are found throughout the area. And what it actually does, it makes these vegetables grow really big. And if you look over there, those lettuces over there are huge. Okay, so with the ancient Aztecs, this is the way that they would produce their food. It was very productive. You're able to feed the entire population. Of the three crops that are most important in the Aztec culture, we had corn, which is known as maize. We had squash, and we had beans. And what they would do is they'd plant them in these chinampas, and they'd plant them in rows, and then they would mix them together. So the squash and the vines can grow up the corn, and the beans would be in there, and the beans let up extra nutrients for the corn. So what the Aztecs had done, they had figured out the perfect mixture of plants to provide the most calories for their diet. The Aztec diet was good enough for the Aztec people to live on, the corn, the squash, and the beans. The only problem was It didn't give them a lot of protein. So the people of Tenochtitlan didn't grow very tall. And actually, a lot of people here were malnourished, which made it much easier for them to be conquered, because when the Spanish arrived, they had brought diseases with them, not intentionally, but as people move, things come with them, like the seeds for the plants. Diseases were easily able to take over the indigenous people of the Americas, and it's believed that something like 90% of the indigenous people were wiped out. Great way to make food, but maybe not the most perfect way. So this is how they farm in Xochimilco.
Right, so this chap's also gone over the three sisters, the squash, corn and beans, which is what we've covered as well. One slight additive to that, they do have sweet potato, which is very, has protein, and the redder the potato, the more the protein. In fact, the really red potatoes they give to pregnant women and the elderly as they reach menopause because of the nutrients. So there's a slight thing that I haven't quite followed there. But this is brilliant, the way these three sisters are still used. And he's talking about it and it's used today. And I think, Lee, I think you did it on the permaculture with those who were quite good, that they grow well together, complement each other like we as people do, and all crops do complement in different ways. So they said about the growing and the combination of the corn, the squash and beans together, their companion planting, which is used today, and the chinampas, which was the floating water gardens, helped to grow these crops in abundance in Mexico and still do. And the development of this agricultural knowledge took place over a period of 5,000 to 6,500 years. It's still used widely to this day and has been imported in permaculture, which is what also we're about, which is putting in for the future and nourishing the soil and our Mother Earth, which because we needed to survive, basically.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly speak to the diagram, because it's something that I'm very interested in. Permaculture is something that we covered in the first workshop of our series in climate. And you can see here, those three really well interact. And I've seen this with my own eyes, how they interact very well. It's the many layers from ground cover all the way up. So the pumpkin squash acts as a kind of living mulch and shades the soil, helps to retain moisture, inhibits weeds. You see there, it's on the floor, it's on the ground, and really does that. Corn grows up, and that corn is like a living support trellis and a protective shady umbrella. It provides sugars to feed nitrogen fixing bacteria for the beans and the bean roots. And the beans kind of curl up and they kind of act as support for the corn. And the bacteria converts nitrogen in soil to boost the growth of the pumpkins and everything else. So the beans do magic stuff, converting the nitrogen in the soil, acts as a nitrogen fixer. So yeah, it's a real chemical and biological synthesis, really. And this was kind of practiced in Mexico, as it says there, thousands of years ago, before they had any sort of access into science and methodological kind of practices. This is all just trial and error, their own experiments, and a kind of spiritual kind of knowledge that kind of Rose was talking about there. Next slide.
And how can we learn from these indigenous practices? I'm going to add something first as well. I think the diversity of things I know is really important, not just planting rows and rows of one or two crops. And if we have diversity, all these plants, like community, nourish each other in the correct, if you find out which ones work with and which ones work against, which they have since time immemorial. They've spent centuries studying what works and what doesn't work, so we do well to learn from ancient sort of traditions from a lot of cultures. Anyway, the soil has been depleted and eroded through industrial agriculture for many centuries, prioritizing profit over our welfare of the ecosystem, which is rampant in the West now with our industrialized agriculture and cutting out the hedgerows everywhere, which have been there for centuries. We lose all the wildflowers and the hedgerows, which host a lot of flowers, wildflowers, which all do their job, as well as the animals that live in them, such as mice and moles and many more, flies and different insects. So we lose out from there. And even on our on the moorlands, there used to be people centuries ago. People used to live on them and flourished on them, and then they took all the top trees away. I don't know if it was for farming, but now that's why we got all the bog, because over the centuries there's nothing to absorb the water when it rains, and it comes down and causes a lot of bogland. That's just one example I can think of. Anyway, our Western, I know you all know this. Anyway, I'm sorry, but that's all you're going to get from me. Our Western society has inherited an exploitive and destructive way of working with the land, and it's built upon domination-based culture, which affects different ethnicities and different parts of the world, as we all know, like South America, Africa, everywhere, India, and we lose out a lot from it. We've lost an awful lot, and now we try to impose our extreme agriculture with GM seeds and that onto every other culture by domination. Anyway, feeding the soil and protecting the natural environment through natural systems such as hedgerows that absorbs water from soil and encourages biodiversity. And the health benefits are mental, spiritual, physical, from growing food on the land. They had a ritualized and devotional relationship with nature that healed themselves, as well as the ecology they inherited. But even in cities now, everyone's so many people are having real mental health issues, and those that are severely suffering in the first place, extremely, I'm seeing so many cases, extremely being admitted to hospital, and even those that are quite maybe what I'd say well balanced, I can't really say that, but would maybe be considered well balanced, are having extreme reactions all the time about the simplest of things, because it's so unhealthy. We've isolated ourselves and isolated, or we've been forced to by governments in a way, by marriage breakdown and moving people away from families initially when they were moved out of London. I'm sorry I'm going off a bit, but I'm going to say it. Moved out of London to families moved away, there weren't housing in London. I'm going back to just after the war, 50s. Then they're far away from each other and they start losing community. It used to be grandparents, parents, cousins, all close proximity, and they worked as a community and with the local community. Doors never used to be locked. There wasn't crime. So when I was a child, all doors were left open. There was no crime. So within since 60 years, since the 1950s, it's deteriorated, and people's mental health it's not the people have mental health, it's that the environment by governments and by domination causes that unhappiness within people's minds. That's my take on it. Sorry, going off. I'm told not to, not by you, but paying homage to the ancestral lineage is so important, and worshipping deities through ceremony at the start of the day, and not even necessarily having to say a prayer, but by just when you see trees dancing in the wind and you're surrounded by nature, you're saying a prayer internally anyway, without even necessarily having to pay homage. You are when you take it in, and it's so beneficial. And such as the Day of the Dead keeps a sense of tradition and heritage from where our background comes from, because what we are today is from our ancestors, whether we're aware once it's so many generations back. I'm Buddhist. We even pray for our ancestors 7 generations each way, just as an example that they acknowledge the importance of what's passed down from generation to generation, and the heritage of culture that has maintained an equilibrium with the environment up to this present day. So I thought I went off, sorry, but that's it, basically. That's your section, isn't it?
Thank you very much, Rose. It's amazing to learn about these indigenous perspectives, and it's really important to understand this in the kind of light of day of what we're facing. So what are we facing? Pandemic, as we have done for the last year and a half, climate crisis, ecological crisis, many other forms of crises precipitating and getting adversely worse on a daily basis. And it's quite harrowing to know that this is happening. Actually chatting to Jess and Ryan before we came on this call about how it's really really sad for me to see how much flooding there is, for example, in the UK, and even London today it's been a whitewash. I've never seen so much kind of water come down and flooding pouring in the last month that I have since living here in London for many years. So what can we do to kind of challenge this, and what do we need to do? So resilience in the face of adversity has become an imperative and vital incentive for us to grow our own food. So growing our own food in terms of food sovereignty is incredibly important. I think through lockdown, people realize that we can't just go to supermarkets and start scrambling around for food and start fighting over food even, because that's kind of the situation that might happen in the future. We need to start growing our own food, actually learning to cultivate, because that is our way of kind of feeding ourselves. And future pandemics, climate crises and so forth necessitates food sovereignty as transport distribution becomes uncertain, the prices soar, and then greater scarcity exists. So with less food, less supply, there's going to be more demand, and therefore prices soar, basic economics. But it's also going to be uncertain in terms of transportation, and this is going to be a huge kind of crisis coming up. Air miles from shipping the food all over the world with many chemicals, fossil fuels burns, create further pollution, plastic and carbon footprint. All of these things are happening at the moment. More air miles being shipped. It's not very good considering the amount of heat rise in temperatures that are happening at the moment. Building stronger local communities with growing at the heart of them brings people together to grow, share, learn from each other. So having things like community gardens, having things like a land project such as Wild Horizons means that growing together, we can actually learn from each other, inspire each other to try and create some changes, to try and transition towards a regenerative agricultural way of being, moving away from this heavily industrialized way of being. And lastly, the provision of locally cultivated food is healthier for our bodies, leads to better mental health and a restored ecosystem. So as a selling point almost, there's three particular benefits there for ourselves, for the kind of our bodies, our minds, as well as the ecosystems for ourselves, people, and the planet. Hopefully that convinces you that these are the things that are very important for us to practice. Next slide. So yes, this is kind of the penultimate slide, really the last slide in terms of the information of all of our workshops. What can we do now we've gone through all of these workshops on climate? What are the solutions, or what are the steps that we need to take to solve some of these issues? So firstly, I want to point to offering resources and times, especially by those organizations run by Black and brown people, Black and people of color, and other targeted identities, those who are marginalized, LGBTQ, for example, disabled people, working class people, people who have been marginalized by society, trying to offer our resources, our time, and our money as well, if we have that sense of privilege, to give back to others, to help them up, to lift them up. For white people, to organize other white folks around these campaigns. It's not the fact that for white people that there may be a sense of burden or sense of kind of responsibility or even guilt. And I think the best way to kind of alleviate this or to kind of tackle that is to organize and to kind of educate others and to campaign vociferously about it, and to kind of put your values into practice when it comes to this, to be a very good ally in essence. So the next point is about self-educating on racism in the food system and the history of sustainable farming, and to talk about it. So yeah, of course, you need to kind of be vocal and to communicate these things. As much as we like to have workshops like this, talking to your friends, your family members, to people, your loved ones, and your neighbors and people on the street, and to kind of educate them about stuff like racism in the food system. Why is sustainable farming really important for us to practice? Form resilient networks of growers, land stewards who share knowledge and skills between each other. Having things like Land Workers Alliance, for example, is a good kind of thing. Via Campesina, a kind of international version of that. There are many kind of movements almost that are taking up, and having those network of growers can only be good. In a style of cooperation, for us to kind of seek to help each other and cooperate can be one of the best ways to kind of tackle some of those bigger systemic issues around policy and advocating for systemic change from governments and so forth. And lastly, here is a campaign to change policy and take direct action. So groups like Extinction Rebellion have been taking direct action, but many other groups in the history of our day has taken direct action against environmental injustice and climate injustice, and that's one of the main points. Oh, we're almost there, Ryan. So the last point there at the bottom, if we are not acting to change the system, we are complicit, casting our silent vote to maintain the status quo. I think it's an important point because so often we are faced with the burden of, oh, there's so many problems, there's so many issues, how do we tackle all of them or any of them? Well, I think there's this kind of feeling of taking things one step at a time and not addressing all of them in one go because it will be burnt out. It's by forming this sense of solidarity, forming this sense of cooperation, and learning to kind of educate one another and to form those kind of resilient networks and to take small steps, whether that be to volunteer in your local community garden or to stop flying or to go and support Wild Horizons by coming to our workshop. Next slide. And this is Jessica.
Thank you so much, Liba. I'm just going to move your spotlight so we can all see each other. Right, so thank you so much everyone for listening. We really, really appreciate your time. And now lastly, we want to just hold a little bit of space for you to ask any questions you may have. Feel free to unmute yourself, turn your video on, whatever you're comfortable with, and just speak or share your messages, your comments, questions in the chat. Any comments, questions? Before anyone leaves, I'm going to share this link here. This is a little feedback page for this workshop, and we would really, really appreciate any feedback you may have. How did we do on this workshop? How can we do better? What was great? What was not so great? We're going to, so basically this was the first part of a 3-part series. So these 3 workshops in the past 3 weeks were on climate. The next set of 3 workshops in September will be on culture, and the following 3 workshops in November will be on capitalism. So we're looking at all these different aspects of our life, really, of our ways of being and into being, and basically life post-COVID, and how we can structure our realities in a different way to live better and more intentionally. So yeah, enough from me. If anyone has anything to say, now's your chance to say it.
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm Diego from Peru, and thank you very much for sharing all the information. I feel very approached with the Mexico story and how was the story is very similar, the Aztecs and the Incas here, and yeah, I appreciate very a lot that you could share. And I consider it very important to highlight all the genetic biodiversity that indigenous communities preserve, although many of the ancestral foods are dying out or no longer exist. And apart from that, I have 2 little questions, or 2 questions. And the first, like, how could a narrative emerge that includes indigenous communities who want to share with city people? Or is it not our decision for that narrative to emerge? And the next question is about my personal practice. Like, I try to form an agricultural community in my neighborhood with the people surrounded, with my neighbors, but it's difficult for me to introduce traditional or agroforestry practices. What strategy could I use? Do you recommend? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diego, and it's really lovely to see you again. And it looks beautiful where you are. I'm a little bit jealous. I think, Liba, do you feel that that's a question you might be able to answer?
Yeah, definitely the first question. The first thing I was thinking, Diego, was so we got COP26 coming up. I'm sure you might know this. COP is a kind of large international forum for kind of climate, for governments, for organizations, for corporations, for big policy making across the and one of the things that are really being put forward with this COP is, I think, indigenous voices. I'm hearing more and more that indigenous voices will be better represented at this COP gathering, COP26, than any other COP that's gone before. So I think there is greater and greater awareness that we need to learn from indigenous people, from indigenous voices, and to really reflect that culture and that sense of connecting to nature, to learn from their perspective, because I think our Western perspective has got us into this mess, ultimately. Our kind of sense of exploitation and domination, this sense of separation, and this sense of kind of nature being something different to us, to be dominated and conquered. I think now learning that the indigenous people have been doing it right and doing it well for a long, long time before us. And maybe we need to kind of retrace that sense of belonging to our roots, to our ancestry. I think that's the kind of first question. And the second question around the kind of practices, yeah, I think there's so many different ways to go about this. And I think one of the things that we've done as Wild Horizons is that have a strong sense of community by meeting regularly, by having workshops that we're offering, for example, by going on courses together, doing kind of learning together, by having kind of regular gatherings in person where we share across weekends. So I think this kind of thing where you run some community events, whether that be a street party in your area, whether you host like a workshop so people can attend, or a learning, instruction, educational offering, these things kind of bring people together, form a sense of kind of belonging or sense of kind of connection. And that hopefully kind of instills a sense of kind of purpose, or maybe that helps to kind of grow your project or your idea. So that's kind of one thing I can say. I'm sure maybe some other people here could add some more to your questions.
Maybe. Just about Teepee Valley. So when I went to Teepee Valley at the weekend, there's lots of, it's a big community over a vast area in Wales. They've been going for a number of years, exactly how many, 20, 30. But they're different. There's some people living in teepees, there's some people, they've built round houses, there's some people are living in stone houses, and they all interact, and they either share, grow certain veg and share with each other, but they're all very, very receptive to each other's needs. They don't step, they check on everyone, whether everything's all right, okay with them. Yeah, they have some internal politics going on, but overall it's pretty, I was really impressed. It was really good, and the people were really having a lot of ideas. For example, it's just one idea, just something slightly different, that there's a lot in the UK, a lot of this Himalayan balsam has just taken over. It's been brought in by somebody and it's taken over and killed all the diversity of what was growing naturally. And the only way you can get rid of it is through chemicals, which then go into this, they won't use because it goes into the rivers, into the sea. So it's, and there's no other way you can really get rid of it, because even if there's one seed left, it spreads. But then what one other person was saying, but there's a few people who are doing honey there, and the bees love it. So there's sort of nothing's absolutely not right. It isn't, but it can be overcome, and said perhaps it is organically how society and our climate's got warmer, but why this is happening, and perhaps we could try and use that. And also on forestry, they were saying like every 10 acres of land, they have an acre of coppice. Willow is what they try to use, and they break it up into a fifth, so 5 fifths. They'll use 1/5 1 year, leave it farrow, is it farrow? Farrow that next year, and so depleting the land and lots of other techniques. There were just a couple, but their way local communities, Jaeger, their way local communities using what's available to them and trying to work with in an organic way with what's how nature's changing, the heat's changing, and different things happen. On recognizing that they don't own the land, and so they're still always sort of. I think some of them, I don't know, some of them own it. The people we spoke to didn't own it, but they're very receptive. And I don't know how it is with other governments in other countries that seem to be really militant, and it's easier slightly in the UK. Sorry, go on.
Pass it to Jeff.
Thank you so much for sharing, Rose. Diego, I just shared a link to Survival International. You may know about them. They're a really, really great group raising awareness of both Indigenous knowledge, kind of Indigenous struggles, especially how Indigenous people are being evicted from the land. And so they're focused very much on raising awareness and educating. So they're a really, really great organization to check out. And Ryan also shared the Indigenous Anarchist Federation. I think I saw some of their stuff on social media. Definitely really, really good stuff. Definitely worth reading some of their work. It's past now. So if there's, Lewa just also shared the Indigenous Peasants Movement. There's a link here in the chat in case anyone's interested. So yeah, if there's no more questions, we are going to close the session. Does anyone have any more questions? No? All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you so much for engaging and for listening. We appreciate it's a very hot day. It's a beautiful summer week, so we really appreciate you being here. If you feel like checking out, please unmute yourself or check out in the chat. And we are going to have another workshop series in September on culture, community, and solidarity, which we will post about on our website, on our Instagram, and other social media platforms. So make sure you follow us. And if you are able to donate a little bit, you can donate on our website, wildhorizons.org. Or any donations are very, very much appreciated. So yeah, that's it from us. If you want to unmute yourself to say goodbye, it'd be nice to hear your voices.
Really.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.